Hi, welcome to Mr. Otter Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to draw and paint a white peony flower. This is a great tutorial if you want to learn how to draw flowers as well as learn watercolor techniques to paint them. These are the supplies that you need. You need watercolor paper, watercolor paints, water. You need watercolor paint brushes. I like to use a 3/4 flat round, and then this is a number 4 round, but I actually think it looks more like an 8 or a 10. Pencil and an eraser, a paper towel, yours doesn't have to have a minion on it, and a scratch piece of paper. Masking tape is optional. Masking tape is optional. It's only if you want to use it to tape a border. You could just draw a border or just ignore it completely and have really loose painterly edges. It's totally up to you. I like to tape the border first just so I know where I'm trying to fit my drawing in. It provides a nice frame, so just grab your masking tape if you choose to do this step and go ahead and tape a border. This painting is going to be square instead of the normal style that we're painting. Make sure you're using the textured side of your watercolor paper and not the smooth side of your watercolor paper. Once you've taped your edges or drawn some kind of frame so you know where you're trying to fit the drawing in, grab your pencil and eraser. When you're drawing, it's helpful to draw large to small, so that you can make sure you fit everything on your paper before you put all of the fine details in. So the first thing we're going to do is just draw the shape of the flower, which is a circle, and it's pushed just a little bit to the left of my paper. I'm going to draw a little bit darker just so you can see my drawing, but make sure you're drawing this part as light as you can. Then we're going to draw another circle inside of it, and this is just showing where the center of the peony is. And then we're going to draw another circle coming around the edges, and then we're going to draw 2 more circles in, leaving a little, let's leave more space in this area. So this is bigger, and then we're going to fit 2 more circles in around it. So we have 6 circles, or 6 pancakes that we've just placed over each other. We will be using this as the framework to draw from. So what is inside of here is the stamen, and it has a few different parts, but we can see this bright pink. And I think that's what really adds a lot of contrast to this flower, and it's really interesting. So this is how you would draw it, and I'm just going to show you really simply, lightly first, and let me erase this so it's not quite as dark. And what we're going to do is just draw 2 dots next to each other, 2 circles, and then we're going to draw 2 circles under that, and 2 circles under that. So we have 6 circles. Then we're going to bring each one of these into a point. We're going to create the shape that's similar to a bowling pin. So we kind of are coming out and up and to the side. With each of these, they don't all need to be going in the similar direction. Some of them might be going up a little bit more and overlapping. Other ones, some of them might be going straight up. But when we paint this in, these are bright pink at the edge. So make sure when you paint around it that you're leaving this part so that you can get this bright pink in the end. And again, make sure you draw really lightly. We're going to start with these petals that are coming around the center. The petals that are in the center of the peony, they're skinnier. They're longer. The edge is a little bit more tattered. I would say on some of them, it almost looks like there's just an M, or sometimes there is a W. In this center section, they stay in this similar shape, but when we move to the very edge, they get fuller and rounder. So the edge of the peony, those flowers that circle around it and make it look like a ball before it's fully bloomed, they're really round. And some of them will have tatters in the edge, so it would be like a round shape like this, but then it will kind of dip in and come around. And some hydrangeas, the older they get, the more feathered, I guess, the edge gets, and you get more dips and more texture along the edge of these leaves. So it just depends on how old the flower is. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out before we start drawing. So the petals in the center look more like this, and as we move out, they're fuller, not quite as tattered or torn. So there's basically 7 petals in the center section, and these ones are on top of everything else. So we're going to draw them first. So there's one that comes straight up, and then it has that M shape that I talked about, and it tapers in as it comes down. There's one right next to it. This just has a point, and this one comes back down. There's one on the side here, and this one's kind of the shape of a Hershey Kiss or like a gumdrop. Next to it is an M shape. Do you see that long M at the bottom? There's another one right in front of this one that just has a point as well. One that's bending quite a bit, and it has the W shape. And then there's one that curves completely over in the center here. So once we do that, we're going to start moving into the section next to it. And what I like to do before I start the next section is erase this line. These petals are going to go through it. So the first one we're going to draw is coming straight down out of the center of this wide M. I'm not going to like number these ones because there's so many. I think it would be a little bit confusing, but I'm going to show you the basics of this next step and you can fill this section in. So you're going to come out It's going to dip down, it's getting tattered, and it's coming back in and dipping behind. Some of these petals start to taper as they get closer to the center, which means they get skinnier, and some of them don't as much. So you kind of just need to pay attention to the flower that you're drawing, and I will put a thumbnail of this flower over here. And one thing to make sure when you're drawing these petals in, some of them are really close to each other and some of them are separated, but you want to avoid drawing them perfectly apart, perfectly distanced apart. They're more random, they're more chaotic. These ones on this side are going towards the same direction, but as we move in this direction, the petals that are right here are actually going straight over, and they're more tattered, and these ones are right next to each other. So make it a little bit more random, and it's going to look a lot more like this actual flower did. And then over here, they're starting to curve in this direction. And they can go past these lines that we drew. They don't need to be perfectly under it. They can pass it, they can go lower than it. It's just an indication to help us know which ones we filled in and which ones we still need to draw. So that's about all I would draw in that layer. So now let's move to the next section. I'm just going to erase these circles. Now you're going to repeat that and you're going to fill in these next two sections. If you want it to be really full, you can add in another layer. So just remember, don't space them evenly around it or it's gonna look a little strange. Group some together, separate others, make some a little bit lower, some a little bit higher, and make sure they aren't going in a perfect radius from the center. Some of them can be going straight, some of them can be going slanted. You can follow along with me or look at the flower and draw your own petals in some of these areas. All right, you can add another layer just behind these ones if you want it to look really full and make it a little bit more random. I'm gonna stop here and erase the circle that I was using to draw these ones in. So I'm just erasing right over my petals, and I can still see them so it doesn't bother me. Now we've completed the center part, let's work on the petals that are going around the outside. These petals are a lot more simple to draw. There's only about 12 of them. They're rounder, they're bigger. So you can follow along with me, of course, or you can draw, your own, kind of look at the petals and see what's going on. The first one I'm going to draw is this circular one that's coming right up out of almost the top, but more of the side up here. And there's just a little bit of texture along the top. There's one right next to it that comes over, dips in a little bit, and then comes over. There is another one on this side that's coming straight out. It's a little bit more pointy. It has a little bit more texture along this bottom edge. In between these, there is a petal, and this one has a V cut out of it. You come back over and curve down, and it's probably not quite as big as that. I might make it just a little bit smaller. Then let's move down to the bottom, and there is a petal that's coming down, curving around and coming back in. There is another one coming diagonally right here that dips in and then comes back. Then there's a big wide one that is in this corner that has some tattered edges. And in this space, there's actually two petals. One of them is coming behind this one, and then the other one is in between these. And this one just almost comes up to a peak and then over and back. In between these two, there's one that's tucked right behind this one. So we're just gonna come right behind it and place that one in there. There's a skinnier one in here that has the W on the top. In between these two, there's a really cool petal that has like a very distinct W, but the top edge comes up and over. That's all of the petals that go around the outside. Take your eraser, erase that humongous circle. Hopefully yours doesn't still show like mine. Let's quickly draw the stem and some of these bottom leaves in. I'm going to add some down on the bottom, but you can keep adding them. You could add some up here. You could add a lighter flower behind it. There's a bunch of ways to fill in the background behind this. So I'm just going to bring one coming out to the corner, another one down. There's one that's curving down, one that's coming through. So just think of these as huge blades of grass. I'm just gonna place the stem right here, and then I'm going to bring in more green. And you can, of course, fill it in a little bit more. If it feels too empty, bring in, a big leaf behind it in this section or there. Don't feel like you have to stick with whatever is in the photograph. Feel free to improvise and change any of it. Now we are ready to start painting. If you are left-handed, set everything up on the left side of your paper. I'm right-handed, so I'm setting everything up on the right side. And now we are ready to start painting. All right, you probably have noticed I lightened up my flower a lot, so I just took my eraser and erased all of the hard edges. You can still see my drawing, but it's a lot lighter, and I really prefer this when I'm painting. If you want to go with more of a graphic style, you can keep those bold lines. If you have ever painted with me before, you know that I like to use puddles when I paint. The reason I like to use puddles is so that you don't have to stop while you're painting and remix a color. It keeps your color consistent, and it also helps you to carry it throughout the painting. So I'm going to make a pretty big puddle in this top tray right here. You can use your bigger flat brush if you want this to go a little faster. And for the shading, since this is a white flower, I'm really glad that this is what we're doing for this tutorial because it's a little bit hard in the beginning to know how to shade something that's white. You can use a lot of different colors. What I recommend is really looking at the photograph or the object that you're painting. And in this case, the shadows in the center are really yellow, and on these outer larger petals, they have more of a blue tint to them. So we're gonna start in the center and we're gonna mix up a shady yellow color. So we're gonna start with yellow, drop it into your puddle, and you'll think, oh, that's really dark. But then when you paint it, it's actually not that dark if you spread it around. So let's add just a little bit more pigment to this. And let's add a little orange or red. I want it to be not as bright. So to do that, we can actually do a few things. We could add a little bit of purple to it, which will make it a little bit grayer if you want. So this is the color we have. And if I add just a little bit of purple to it, or violet, that's what we get. So I mean, if you can't tell, that's fine. It's very subtle. Just makes it a little bit more muted and not as bright. So if you like it bright, don't add the violet to it and keep it the color that it is. Let's get started. As we're painting in the center, just make sure not to paint over the stamen or those bowling pin shapes that are in the center. And what we're going to do is add some of the shading. So I'm going to make sure that I leave the top part of these bowling pins completely white at this point. So I'm just going to paint like the bottom part of it, leaving the top part so that I can paint it in later. So I'm just leaving any of the tops of these shapes. I want to leave it completely free of this color because this is just going to be the shadow that goes around it. Once you paint in a little bit around those bowling pins, put some paint on your brush. And usually if I'm painting a small area in, I just like to touch my paper towel so I don't have quite as much on my brush because it's hard to control. And then we're going to put it on the bottom of our petals or the pointed part that is towards the center. And then as we move towards the edge of the petal, we're just getting a little water on our brush and blotting it off and trying to create a really smooth transition from light to dark. So do that on all of your petals in the center. So we're just going to create a shadow along the bottom. And then as it moves up, I'm just rinsing my brush off, blotting it off, and then going next to it to smooth it out towards the end. So again, in here, I'm just trying to make sure I don't go over that bowling ball shape, and I'm just going to bring it right over onto this next petal. Another reason to leave these edges lighter is because what's going to define them are the shadows, usually that's behind them. Now let's paint in the center section using this technique, adding some shadows to separate some of these, and then I will show you how to create the shadows on these outside petals. So like, do you see how just bringing the shadow in behind this one really created the edge of this petal? And you might get to a point where you're not sure where to go next. And what I usually do is like to blur my eyes and see what part is blending together. Where do I need a little bit more separation to show that there's two petals there and not one? And it's okay for them to kind of blend into each other, but you might need just a little bit more definition in some parts to separate the petals and add those shadows that show that they're kind of popping out from the center. And this part's kind of fun. It just really starts to make it look a little bit more 3D and add depth to your painting. And as you get to the edge, they might start to kind of blend into each other, and that's okay. Don't worry about adding any color on these outside edges because these back petals will really start to emphasize them. So look at the center and add any more shadows that you would like. If there's any parts that you feel like need just a little bit more depth, you can just add the same color over the top and it will give it that definition. After you paint in the center section, you can create another puddle, and we are going to choose a different cooler color for these back petals. So make another puddle in your tray by dropping water into it. And we want this to be a little bit cooler, and by cooler I mean having just a little bit more blue in it. So I'm going to grab my blue and drop it in there. I don't want it to be completely blue. So since I used a little bit of orange in my puddle, and I'm just going to grab a little bit of orange, mix it in with my blue. Why wouldn't I add a little bit of yellow to it like my puddle has? Because it would turn it green, and I don't want it to be green. It is not green in my photograph. So then I have this light blue color, and this is getting close. It's not as dark as we need it. So let's darken it up a little bit more by adding more blue and more orange. If you want it to be less blue, add more orange. If it's a little bit too orange for you, you can add more blue. We just want it to be about the same tone. We don't want it to be a lot brighter than this color. So this is what this color looks like, and we are going to go ahead and paint in some of these back petals using it. All right, now that you have your shadow color mixed up and you have the center part painted in, we are going to paint in these back larger petals. So grab your round brush, dip into that shadow color, Since I'm right-handed, I'm starting on the left and moving to the right, but if you're left-handed, you can start on this side. Some of these shadows, they're not quite as detailed as the ones below them, but let's see, I'm just gonna start up in this corner, and I'm gonna start up on the top of this petal. And I have a lot of paint on my brush, which I probably don't need quite as much. So I'm rinsing it off, blotting it off on my paper towel, and then going next to it because I don't want this to look like it's striped, and then just filling in the rest of the flower. And I can come along these edges and make them a little bit sharper. And then I'm gonna skip this petal and move to this one. And this one, remember, has like a little bit of a bend in it. So I'm just going to indicate that right here. And if you have a lot of paint on your brush, it's kind of hard. So I'm just blotting my brush off, coming back in, and this is really going to give this outside petal a lot of definition as I bring the shadow in behind it. And I'm just gonna paint a little bit up into this side, add a little bit of a shadow here and in here. Rinse my brush off, dry it off, and then come along these edges and smooth them out. So you do have to do this part fast enough that it's still wet. If it's dry, it's really hard to do this blending that I'm doing. But remember, we are defining the petals that are on top of it. So keep that in mind as you start shading. Okay, let's work on this petal right here. And the darkest shadow I see is just right up here behind these petals. It almost comes in like a line over here and then 2 lines in this direction. So add those lines in with your paintbrush, those shadows, I guess. Rinse your brush off, blot it off, and then just smooth out those edges. We're gonna skip this one and move right into this one. So this one has like a little V in the middle of it. So I'm gonna start right in between these petals. This one really just has kind of a shadow along the center. And I'm just coming along it, bringing it all the way to the edge right there, coming underneath it over here, and just smoothing it out towards the edge. And then we'll skip this petal and come right into this one. And this one, the whole thing is pretty dark, especially in the center around these petals. So I'm just bringing this all the way to the edge. And we'll tie this darker color into the center when we add some of the other shadows. And then let's come straight over to this one, and there's more of a shadow on the right side. Sometimes you might need to keep mixing your puddle. The colors will start to separate. So you just come in here and come right along this edge on the left side, and then there is another shadow that comes straight through the middle. Rinse your brush off, smooth out those edges. And the reason we're smoothing it is we just don't want these stripes. We want it to look like a shadow instead of a cliff or a fold. And then this petal has a lot of shading just along the bottom, but not a lot at the top. So I'm just gonna start at the bottom, painting right next to these petals and re-outlining them and sometimes just adding the edge. Rinsing my brush, blotting it off, and then smoothing it out again. And you're going to continue this same technique with all of the petals. So look, where you see the shadows, and you're gonna put those in. We just have these ones left that are kind of the in-between petals. So you can add shadows that will separate them a little bit. Now you want to take that blue and just add a few more shadows in the center of your peony just to give it a little bit of definition. You can add some darker shadows around the edges if you would like to define your petals a little bit more. And remember, all we used was orange and blue. Now I've just made a little bit of a darker shadow color, and I'm going to add it in any of the areas that I feel like need it, like maybe on some of these edges just to show the depth. And then I rinse my brush off, blot it off, and lightly just go along the edge. So anywhere you need a darker shadow, you can drop it in. I can even use this blue to come right into the center and add some of those shadows if I feel like it needs it. Also be careful, this is the point where you might just want to stop and look at it and not overwork it. So we're doing the same thing we did before. We're just not covering really large areas and being more concerned and more detailed about where we're putting some of these really darker shadows. This will really start to make some of these petals have some definition and some separation, which some of them need and some of them might not. So let's work a tiny bit more in the shadows on the inside. So use that yellow color that we had mixed up before. And remember, that was yellow with a little bit of red and just a touch of violet. And I just want to put it in a few spots. Again, this is just to separate some of these petals and add a little bit of definition. And again, this part is optional. You could be done right where you are. So we'll paint our background all over everything, and then we'll paint the green stem and the green leaves on it. You can make it whatever color you want. You could do a black background, a light yellow background. The background that I have in the photograph is like a jade green, which I think is just beautiful. I might add a hint of purple to it, but we do need quite a big puddle mixed up for this. So to make jade, I'm just using blue with a little bit of green, and I also could just use yellow. It makes it a prettier color if you just use yellow to create it. So just a dab of yellow and blue. So this is really, really light, and this is maybe a little too blue. Let's add a little bit more yellow to it. Be careful also as you're mixing not to splatter paint on your flower. All right, so now I've darkened it up a little bit. I like that color. And I'm just gonna start painting in my background. And I want it to be loose, but I want it to be semi-flat, so I don't wanna see a ton of brush strokes in it. To get that effect, you need to paint quickly. If you're more comfortable using your small brush, go for it. It really, how you do it is up to you. But I'm going to start in this corner and move to this corner. And so I'm going to leave a puddle, a pretty big puddle of paint right here, because I wanna have something to pull from. I don't want it to start drying. So you'll just see it looks really juicy, really nice. Don't be afraid to overlap, and don't be afraid to leave white. It's totally fine. Don't forget about your little bowling pins that are in the center. If you want it to look a little bit more like the actual flower, you just want to add red with a little bit of violet. Okay, so this should be a little bit darker. All right, then you can come in and add those areas. If it's a little bit too dark, you can add a little bit of orange to brighten it up. And if you can see where these shapes are, that is kind of the hardest part, at least for me, is finding them again. So there were 8 of them, and if you can't find them, that's okay. After you do that, we're gonna mix up a darker green. So I want this to be a dark green, so I definitely want it to be more green than blue, and I'm going to add just a little bit of red to it. You could add probably a little bit of violet to it too if you wanted it to tie into the flower a little bit more. So this is what it looks like, and this is what it looks like over that background color. So it's dark, but it's not black. You can redraw in these leaves in your stem if it's a little bit hard to see, but I really like to paint these right over my background. And again, you can fill this background in with these. It's really up to you what you choose to include in this part. Make sure your background's dry when you do this, or it's just going to take the color off of your background. After you have painted in your petals, and I need to let this dry just a little bit, you're going to take your tape off. You can pull your tape from the opposite side if it starts to tear. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for painting with me.